Welcome back to the channel. This is Chris Morrison, and in this video, we're going to do our third lesson on learning to read Greek by actually reading the Greek New Testament. We're going to be looking at John chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. So if you have not seen the first couple of lessons here, check the link in the description below and you will see them there. Let's go ahead and look at our text here, and I will read it in Greek. It goes something like this. Houtos ein in arche prostantheon. Panta di autu egenita, kai chorus autu egenita udehen. Ha genanin in autu zoen ein, kai hezoe ein to taphos ton anthropon. And now, just like before, let's look at our vocabulary so that some of this makes a little more sense to you. Now, I don't have to go through this line by line as before, because at this point, you should know your alphabet and you should be able to read these pretty well. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick. Houtos it's a relative pronoun meaning he or she or it or this one. Panta means all. You may want to note the word pas is the same word in a different case, and pas is the more common word. Panta can mean all or every. Dia is a preposition that, at least in this context, is going to mean through or by. Autu means of him or of it. Egenita means he, she, or it came into being or came into existence. Choris means apart from, it's a preposition. Ude means not. Hen, notice the rough breathing mark there, hen, not in. Hen means one. Geganin is the same word as egenita, but in a different tense. This is he, she, or it has come into being. Zoe means life. Ta is your definite article, another version, which means the. Phos means light. Tone, another definite article. This one plural, meaning the. And then anthropon, meaning men or human beings or mankind or something along those lines. So having said that, we can now begin to look at the grammar. Before we do, let's give a quick wooden translation, if you will. You never actually translate it this way, but kind of a one-to-one correspondence. And you should immediately start to catch the drift of the verse. It would go something like this. He was in the beginning with God. All things through him came into being, and apart from him came into being not one thing which has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Okay, so more or less pretty wooden there. Let's get to some of the grammatical points. You need to kind of polish that up and see what you need to understand this a little more. First thing is that phrase here in red, diautu. Notice that it says di and not dia. It's worth noting that there are some prepositions that can be shortened. Notice it has delta iota with the apostrophe on the end rather than the alpha. If you were to go back, you would see dia has an apostrophe on the left side, third one down, whereas here, you see the apostrophe takes the place of the alpha. That's just to save some space. Just know sometimes prepositions can be shortened. It's pretty easy. If you feel like that's complicated, you're going to see it every time. It's not hard at all. Dia is just shortened to D. So when you see that, don't be surprised. Second of all, now we get to start getting into verbs. This verb is agenita. And if you look back to your vocabulary, agenita means basically he, she, or it came into existence or came into being. I want you for now to think about this verb as a past tense verb. That's not actually correct, and we'll add to that later on. But for the time being, it's called an aorist. We'll see that on the next page. You can think of this as a past tense verb. It's also worth noting that the way you know it's past tense is simply by the way that it is spelled. The present tense, and it's the same word I have listed here, is genomai. And genomai sounds very different from agenita, and yet it's the same word. One is just the past tense, and the other is the present tense. That's not so different from English. If we say run is the present tense and ran is the past tense, you know by the spelling that one's present and one's past. Same here. The spelling feature you want to look for in this past tense verb is this epsilon at the beginning. That epsilon at the beginning tells you that this is in this past tense, and though it's not it comes to be, but rather it came to be. Now, to show you that in a little bit more detail, and this is a tool that you might find helpful, I'm going to minimize myself so you can see this a little better. This is taken from the blueletterbible.org. And here's the text of John 1:3, and I just pulled that up, and you can see Panta di autu egenata kai koris autu egenata ude hin ha geganen. And so if you were to click there, egenata, it gives you all of the information. Here's the root word, genomai, which is present tense. Of course, we know this means came into being. And it says here that it's a second aorist middle deponent indicative. What is all that? We'll get into that later on. For now, this aorist is the idea of it being past tense. So easy enough. This is a nice tool if you can't remember, what the word is. This is it's called parsing, to be able to get all that background information about the verb. You may find that useful. Moving on then, I want you to note, let's be careful. There's some words we can confuse. Note in, which of course means in, and then hen, the second word in red there. Hen, notice the rough breathing mark again, means one. So be careful not to confuse those. They are not the same thing. And now we have another use of the definite article. We've seen, 3 uses, I think, at this point. Now here's a fourth use. Sometimes the definite article doesn't mean the. Sometimes it doesn't make the concrete abstract. Sometimes it's all sorts of things. Sometimes it doesn't occur before names. Sometimes it is a pointer word. And so it can be translated that or which is the case that we see here. So we might translate this something like that which came into being in him. So the idea here would be starting from the kai chorus, and apart from him came into being not one thing. You don't say one, it's a one thing, which came into being. In him was life. So again, you can then sometimes the context is just kind of have to tell you what the definite article is doing. And there are still more uses of the of the definite article. All right, a few more grammatical notes. Note it's not obvious where this particular sentence ends. You may or may not know this, but in the original Greek text, there was no punctuation. So this could be translated one of two ways. It could be, again, starting from the kai here, and apart from him came into being not one thing which has come into being. That's one way to read it. Or you could read this as, and apart from him came into being not one thing. That which came into being in him was life. Two different implications. How do you decide which one it is? Context. This is one of the reasons I told you can see things clearer in Greek. And if you notice, there is no way to translate that neutrally. You have to make a choice. In Greek, this is not clear, and you have translators who argue for it both ways. Most people side with the idea of the original translation, the idea of apart from him, not one thing was made which has been made, or not one thing came which has come into being. That's why most people render this, but you could render it that which came into being in him, or that which was made in him was life. That's a perfectly valid translation. What I want you to notice here is there's no punctuation. Any of your Greek texts that do have punctuation, that was added by editors because the original text did not include punctuation. And then the last grammatical issue I want to show you is we get our other two cases. Remember, we talked about the nominative case and the accusative case. I have the nominative case there in blue, hutas, the omicron sigma lets you know this is the subject of that particular sentence, ton theon, the omicron nu lets you know that this is an accusative case. Well, now we have two new cases. Now we have what are called the genitive case, and we're also going to see the dative. The genitive case is used normally to show possession or show origin. It's going to end typically in an omicron upsilon, as I have it here in green, or an omega nu, as we have it in the bottom two. So autu and anthropon, those are genitive. So in the case of here, the idea autu, through him, we'll talk about genitives and prepositions later, but for now, that was made through him, but then apart from him, because again, prepositions. But notice here, it was the light of men. So this is a nominative because the sigma on the end, nominative of men. And so it's something related to men. It was in some ways, it's our light. It was made for us, etc. Okay. So again, that's the genitive case. And then the dative case is typically used to show the object of, so it's receiving an action. It's an indirect object kind of thing, okay? It's going to end in an iota. And notice here, in both of these cases, the iota is underneath the letter. It's under the eta and it's under the omega, but very often datives will end in an iota. So here we have, he was in the beginning. Well, the beginning is not receiving the action. It's an indirect idea. So he's in the beginning. And again, in auto. Your word in is always going to have, this preposition is always going to have a dative after that. I will continue to point out these sorts of nominative, genitives, datives, and accusatives as we go for several lessons until it becomes obvious in second nature. But for now, the four, once again, are your nominative. In fact, I'll just show you here. The nominative is used to show the subject of the action, usually ends in an omicron sigma or just a sigma. The accusative shows the recipient of the action, ends in nu. The genitive case shows origin or possession, usually ends in omicron upsilon or an omega nu. And then the dative case is usually an indirect object, usually ends in an iota, either at the end or as a subscript. There are many more uses of these cases we'll get into, but again, as we first get started, if you have this down pat, you'll have a very good idea of what is going on. So now let's get into some interpretation. First of all, I want you to note, as we said in the first class, and maybe you can see a little more why, that the Jehovah's Witnesses of a God in John 1:1 part C does not follow. Here are two verbs here that are clearly definite that do not have a definite article. Look at this. He was in, is this the beginning or a beginning? It's clearly the beginning, and yet there's no definite article. That which was made, in him was life, or in him was life. Not in him was a life, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. So again, just because you don't have the definite article doesn't make the noun indefinite. So context is going to tell you if, again, the use of definite articles, context is also going to tell you whether or not a particular noun should be definite or indefinite. Second, I want you to notice how emphatic that John is, that all of these things are in and through Christ. Notice, first of all, it says very clear that all things are in him, and apart from him, nothing was made, not one thing which has been made. Now, you can be very wooden and try to get this idea across in English. You could translate this, he was in the beginning with God, all things are made through him, and apart from him, not one thing was made which has been made. But that's not very good English, and maybe kind of King James-ish. And so a lot of your modern translations kind of smooth that out, but then you lose the emphasis. But the emphasis is very clear in Greek. Panta choris hin. I mean, the hin there is very strong. Not one thing which was made. Okay? Or not. So the third thing I want to show you, again, related to this, is the progression of prepositions. Through him, apart from him, in him. And if I was going to preach this, this is probably what I would focus on, because that connection, through him, apart from him, in him. He was in the beginning. All things were through him. Apart from him is nothing, and what's in him is life. So maybe you have an idea for a bit of a sermon there. And what that's doing is that's orienting all things to Jesus. He's in God, right? That's your first thing. He's in God. Through him is everything. Apart from him is nothing. And what's in him is life, because he, of course, is in God. And that life is the light of men. So in Christ, you have this connection between God and man. It's really beautifully stated. You don't have to have it in Greek, but I think the Greek really, really brings out and makes it obvious. So final translation, we might go something like this, and maybe you can see it clearly now. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, not one thing came into being which came into being. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. Beautiful, beautiful passage. So I would encourage you, let's keep studying together. Go over this. We've covered several things, especially those introductory cases can be pretty confusing. Really try to get your mind around those different cases, their uses, the initial kind of spelling differences, and then we will see you back here next time. Until then, may you be richly blessed.